it's very average. See a story from they basically
no. I have a friend who's a baby, so I didn't really.
that's tough. So there's a lot of way you are.
Me too. My pride and joy. She's in photograph. She wants to get like little tiny things. But she has to take care of it. So I'm pleased to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Conor McGowan. He is from the Auburn unit at the Alabama Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at Auburn University. He is the acting unit leader there. He got his undergraduate and bachelor's degree at Wake Forest University, the master's at North Carolina State, and his PhD at the University of Missouri. He attended a postdoc at the Technical Research Center. He does a lot of work on decision making and wildlife management, especially with endangered and threatened species. And today he'll be talking about the applications of the species status assessment paradigm to endangered species decision making. So join me in welcoming Conor, please.
Thank you. Hey everyone. Thanks for coming to my seminar, my presentation today. I'm excited to give this. Some of this stuff is brand new. I don't think I've presented it before, so that's kind of fun. I've got this talk organized. I'm going to start off by talking for a few minutes about species status assessments and what they are. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about two different applications of that paradigm to listing decisions for species under the Endangered Species Act. So I want to thank you guys for your time today. I've had lots of really good conversations with you. I enjoyed lunch with the grad students. I enjoyed my walk around campus this morning. You guys are all doing really cool work, and I've had a really good time chatting with you. So thanks for the invitation. And thanks for the opportunity to present today. And with that, I will get right into it. So, the species status assessment is this emerging or new-ish paradigm that the Fish and Wildlife Service is using to put together all the scientific information that they need to help support decision-making for endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. It's emerging, and it's trying to introduce these objectives for the scientific part of their decision-making that allows the service biologist to spend more time on science and dealing with the scientific information and not worrying about the decision-making part. So it's kind of separating out this science from the decision-making part. The overall goals are also to increase the transparency and consistency of how these analyses are done prior to decision-making, and allow that transparency so that outside groups can see the information that went into a decision if they're ever evaluating the decision that was made. So the species status assessment is a small piece in how the service goes about making these decisions. This is, I don't want to hit the wrong button, right? Let's see. Oh, there it is. So this is like a workflow diagram for a decision process for I think it's basically a listing decision process. And so the service has these different steps, and the first one would be called project planning, which is when they look out on the tasks that they have to do in order to make this decision, and they lay out a timeline for that decision making. And sometimes those timelines are pretty rigid. The species status assessment is this second step in this process where they gather all the information that they have about the species, they analyze data, they write reports, and they also send it out for peer review. And then that product here goes into a decision analysis. They have to write a decision document, and then that decision document is put out for review in the Federal Register. So it becomes a proposed rule or whatever at the end of that process. So what we're talking about mostly is this information gathering and analysis step here that's then used in these decision portions later on. This is a little different for me because I'm a structured decision-making guy. I've worked on those structured decision-making projects a lot, and one of the paradigms that we've tried to sort of hammer home in that structured decision-making world is that the science and the decision, science and the policy are inseparable. And here we're actually specifically separating that science part out. So I had to get used to that, and you guys are going to have to get used to it too for the rest of this talk at least. But there are, the scientific document, the species status assessment, has three essential components to it. The first is to describe the species biology. It's a real thick literature review of basically everything we know about that species. And in doing so, we describe what the species needs are, what it needs to thrive and survive on the landscape in order to be a happy, healthy animal. We then analyze the current status of the species, and in part we do that by thinking about, well, what does it need, and what does it have on the landscape? And if those two things are vastly different, then we know we might already have a problem for that species. And then the third part is to try to predict what the future status of that species is going to be, thinking about what it has, what its needs and its haves are going to be in the future. So the species status assessment, they're usually long, pretty heavy documents, but these are the three essential components of one of those documents. So we do this assessment of the current status and the future status through this lens of these terms called the three R's: the representation, the resiliency, and the redundancy. And these have specific definitions. The overall goal is to try to assess the viability of the species, which is the ability of the species to sustain populations in the wild beyond biologically meaningful time frames. This stuff is a little jargony, but this is pulled right out of the guidance documents for the Wildlife Service on how to do these. The first way of assessing the viability is through this thing called representation. And so will the species have the ability to adapt to changing environmental conditions currently and in the future? And so really what you're trying to do there is preserve things like genetic diversity. Do an assessment and see if there's genetic variation across the range, or there's some pockets of seemingly unique genetics in one part of the range versus another. You can also look at ecological diversity across the range. So maybe in the eastern edge of the range they eat different things than they do in the western end of the range. And so we don't want to lose all the eastern animals because we can't just take ones from the west and put them back in the east after the fact. So we want to make sure that those sort of unique or sort of specific things about their biology from across their range and throughout their lives are represented in the future. The second is resiliency, and this is the ability of populations to withstand stochasticity. So that's pretty straightforward, right? We have to have a population that's either large enough or spread out enough to deal with catastrophic events like a fire or a disease or a flood or something. And then lastly is redundancy. Do we have what number of resilient populations do we have that represent all of the genetic and ecological diversity of the species that's important to retain? So the service put together these training documents and these guidance documents to try to train all of their biologists on how to do this stuff. This is a new approach to decision making for the service. They used to do these things called 5-factor analyses, which was they go through a set of factors and assess whether or not they're affecting the species, and then they go ahead and make a decision as to whether or not to list it. This is a new paradigm where we had to write guidance documents and get those out to the service and then start working on how to train the field biologists on how to do this stuff. Part of that training and part of that work is trying to get people more comfortable with modeling, because in order to make these future predictions about the species status, we have to have some sort of a predictive tool. A prediction requires a prediction. And so we try to encourage them to think about we call this the core conceptual model, and it's a generic way of thinking about species viability and how, in order to have viable species, we have to have resilient populations. That population resiliency is a function of their life history and their demographics, which is a function of their habitat and their environment. So that's the basic sort of core conceptual model. And this is the starting point that we tell our biologists to start with. When you're sitting down to start an SSA project, start thinking about, well, what makes a population resilient? What are its life history characteristics? And then for those characteristics, what kind of habitat resources does it need? What kind of environmental inputs does it need? in order to thrive. And this is an example of one of those diagrams that I actually elicited from one of our teams. I think you'll see this again later on, but the idea is to construct a life history diagram that we can then start to think about, what aspects of the environment are influencing these components of their life history. So we can think about needs. We can expand these conceptual diagrams to be fairly complicated things, and this is actually fairly simple compared to some of the ones that I'll show you later on. But again, you're working towards thinking about the population resiliency by thinking of it as a function of its demographics, which are a function of its habitat and other environmental factors, and perhaps some anthropogenic factors out here on the outside. So once we've walked through that conceptual modeling exercise, we now have a map to guide us through the rest of our assessment of this species. The second step is going to be to think about their current condition on the landscape. And so we can look at our conceptual diagram of what they need and think about what habitat characteristics might we measure on the landscape to determine whether or not their current status is good or bad, or whether their needs are being met. We can also look at data to see if we can estimate demographics for that population and see if they're going to add up to a resilient population by first thinking about their needs. And then the next, we can do that across multiple populations so that we can replicate that sort of assessment for several of our populations to see if the species is then going to have the viability it needs. We also would then want to build some kind of a predictive model to predict that future metric of status, of viability into the future at some point, some biologically meaningful time period, and use the models to try to predict what that extinction risk or growth rate or something about that population is going to be in the future. And these models that we build all root back to that core conceptual model that we elicited from the experts to guide us through thinking about what they need and how to build these systems. So the last thing that we do is then ask ourselves, is the species viable overall? And that species viability is a function of all these populations and their viability. So each one of these has a core conceptual model or other ecological conceptual model that branches out from here. And so we can assess the redundancy, how many of these populations are resilient, and assess the representation by saying this one is genetically unique compared to these three. That's why its arrow is a little bit darker and thicker. And so we can pass that information into the scientific document and give it to the decision makers as they start to go through their decision process. So we've spent some time building that sort of framework, that conceptual framework on how to do these analyses, and then we jumped right in and started applying these ideas to listing decisions for the species. And I have two examples that I wanted to present today. The first is this Sonoran desert tortoise example, which is a candidate species, or it was a candidate species out in the western U.S. in the desert southwest, primarily in region 2. So here's a picture of its range. It's here in western central Arizona, all the way down into Mexico in the Sinaloa province. The species was recently recognized as a distinct species from the Mojave Desert tortoise. And the Mojave Desert tortoise itself is already listed. So genetic work, I believe it was in 2007, showed that the Sonoran desert tortoise is actually a different species, and so therefore that portion of the range was no longer listed. As soon as it was recognized as an independent species, the service got a petition to list the Sonoran desert tortoise. That was not all that surprising that it was a different species because it has some different ecological characteristics than the Mojave tortoise. The Mojave tortoises live in the valley bottoms. They get run over by cars a lot. They interfere with cattle. A lot of people don't like them because they dig holes and then the cows break their legs. And so they're living on the valley floors. They're eating plants on those valley floors and living in and amongst people a lot more than the Sonoran tortoise, which tends to live on the rocky slopes. They don't interact with cattle as much. They like different kinds of soil, typically. And they're living further east and south than the Mojave tortoises, which are up in this range. Whoops. Anyway, so a couple of interesting things. It has a very, very diverse diet. It doesn't seem to be very picky. About 200 species of plants have been observed in its diet, and it's eating exotic plants just as equally as it's eating native plants out there. It's a very long-lived species. Experts think that these tortoises, can live for 80 years or more. And, 50 years is definitely easy. 80-year tortoise is probably not really that unusual. So along with that long lifespan, they have very slow reproduction and high early life mortality. So they'll lay some eggs. Most of those eggs are not going to make it through their first few years. But once they do, they're going to live for a long time. Did I just kill the system? Maybe not? All right, we're back. Okay. So, I did mention this already, that the Center for Biodiversity Conservation petitioned the Fish and Wildlife Service to list the Sonoran desert tortoise as soon as it was recognized as an independent species from the Mojave tortoise. They Service did a 12-month finding back in 2011, which is kind of the old version of doing one of these species status assessments. They did a 5-factor analysis, which is really a process that just looks at all the things that could be bad and could be going wrong for this species and kind of checking boxes. And if it checks enough boxes, then it's going to rise to the level of warranting listing. So at that time, they decided that the species probably should be listed, but it was precluded. They have this weird purgatory category where weren't super precluded means that it's probably in bad shape, but we have other species that are in worse shape and take priority. So we're going to list them and deal with them first, and we'll come back to this tortoise later. So the service was then sued again because the tortoise sat in this purgatory state for a couple of years, and then in a settlement, the service agreed to do one of these new status assessments, one of these new species status assessment approaches. And they were required to finish that decision process and decide whether or not to list it by September of 2016. So they brought me in to try and help with this decision process, or with this modeling process, excuse me. They recognized pretty early on that they had the opportunity to do a somewhat more quantitative and sophisticated modeling effort than you might do for some species, because they had a lot of data available. There was but there was a few really long-term demographic studies, like 25 years of marking and recapturing these tortoises. So they had a lot of good data and a lot of opportunity to build a demographic projection model. But we only had about 8 to 10 months to put this together. So rather than me spending a bunch of time reading literature and getting to really know these species super well, maybe going on some hikes and finding some tortoises, instead we held an expert meeting and brought together all the people that know these animals really, really well. And as we discussed at lunch, I stood at the front of the room and asked a bunch of dumb-sounding questions and to try and elicit the information from the experts on how the system worked. So we used that expert meeting and we invited experts from the state agency, from the university, researchers were involved, from other federal agencies like the BLM and the USGS. We had a meeting in the room in Arizona to elicit these models from them. And we started off with this life history diagram that I showed you before. So I start by asking questions like, how many life stages are there? Do the adults produce babies? Well, how about these juveniles? Do they produce babies? No, they don't breed. That's why they're juveniles. Do all the adults breed every year? No, actually probably only 80% of them breed. It depends on who bred last year and how much rain there is. So we start to see, we need a probability of breeding component of this productivity model. How many years do they stay in each of these life stages? How many juvenile stages do we need to have? So does their predation pressure change dramatically over the course of their life? And every time that predation pressure might change, you might create a new life stage in this period between being born and becoming a breeding adult. And then we started to look at things like, well, what's affecting that survival parameter? Weather, forage, predation, weather, forage, predation. So we identify from this life history diagram the key life stages, and then some of the key parameters that we might need to get data on or literature values on in order to build some predictive tool for the species. And so we start to dig a little deeper into some of these components and start thinking about the ecology and what the species needs. So over here on the right are all of those demographic parameters that are important: survival of adults, survival of juveniles, of the large juveniles, the growth rates, productivity, the fecundity, and then the proportion that breed. And all of those things are a function of these complicated conceptual diagrams. And so we tackled these pretty complicated things, even including climate change, which has this scary circular line around it because climate change is intimidating. And I just wanted to follow through one of these because it'll become important, just so you can see how these discussions go. So climate change, what's it expected to do? Well, it's going to change the precipitation patterns in the winter and in the summer. And that's going to affect the availability of these things called ephemeral water catchments, which is just a fancy phrase for puddles. And so they're going to have limited access to puddles if the precipitation goes down, which is going to affect their ability to drink, which is then going to affect their survival rates. So water, I mean, they live in the desert. Availability of water is actually kind of important. And so we elicited a lot of these different effects pathways to figure out what were the influences on that, on those key demographic parameters. So you can kind of see that we're still thinking about what's the resiliency of this population, and it's a function of these demographic rates, and those demographic rates are a function of the ecosystem and what they need in terms of forage availability and water availability, which is a function of these invasive grasses maybe, and fire frequency. We had some of these little loop-de-loops here. I call them wormholes because on the other whiteboard on the other side of the room, there's a whole other diagram about fire frequency and how that affects the viability of the species. So a little wormhole across the room to a different whiteboard on that one. So we had that meeting and we elicited all those conceptual diagrams of how their ecology worked. And that was really useful for us to know, to start to get an idea of how we might model this system and the key things that we were going to need to try to predict in the future to make good predictions about the future of the species. So the next step was to try to think about representation and what kind of representation was out there with the species and what we needed to try and preserve. Normally what we would do then is identify sort of, I got to be careful with the words that I use because the service has all of these legal definitions behind the word distinct or arbitrary. So I keep getting caught in these meetings using those words. But we set up these what we call analysis units, and we do that based on the distinctiveness of the animals within those analysis units. And so we ask questions like, you know, are these animals up here genetically the same as these animals down here? Are there reasons to believe there might be some sort of uniqueness here? I can't say distinct because that takes you into the realm of distinct population segment, which is a whole another listing decision process. But uniqueness of some sort about up here or down here, well, no, the genetic data indicate that there's really no way to distinguish an animal caught here from an animal caught there. How about ecological? Do they forage on different foods? You know, over here, maybe they eat different things than they do over here. We couldn't identify anything obvious in the literature and anybody's expertise that said there was clear analysis units to make. So we first started making one giant analysis unit for the whole species. But we decided to separate out Mexico from the U.S., figuring we did that because we figured that there would be, at the very least, management differences across that border. There's some indication in the next couple of years there may be a major barrier between Mexico that might serve as future genetic differentiation. Mainly it was that there's probably management differences. There's also definitely different invasive grass problems down here in Mexico, and they manage their cattle differently than they do in the U.S. So we created an analysis unit here for the U.S. and one for Mexico. Our next step was to try and think about what the current status of the species was on the landscape. But I'm spending a little less time on this representation and current conditions work because most of my contribution was for the future condition work. So I'm just going to go through this stuff pretty quickly. The current condition was based on a GIS analysis. So we took those conceptual diagrams of what kind of habitat they needed, things about the fire frequency, which I didn't show you. The wormhole went to the fire frequency one. The types of vegetation that they prefer, the invasive grass layers. We took all of that, and we had all these GIS layers from the BLM that mapped for most of Arizona, and some of those components were also mapped for the portion of Mexico where the tortoises live. And we built a probable current presence model that says, you know, if you have the right elevation and the right slope and the right kind of vegetation, and that came up with a potential habitat layer for us. And then layered on top of that where there were grazing allotments and where urban growth was happening and recreation and stuff like that. And we came out with habitat quality. So we had an overall probable habitat, and then from there we separated that probable habitat into a low quality, okay quality, and good quality habitat. And we had different density estimates for the tortoises, from some of these long-term studies, these 25-year studies on the tortoises at various sites. They have different densities. We can relate that to the types of habitat that they were living in, and we extrapolated that across the map. And so that's how we came up with the current population estimate for the species. It was a wide-ranging estimate from somewhere around, I'm going to say like 220,000 to 350,000 was the total possible number of tortoises out there in Arizona and Mexico. But that became our starting point for the future predictions on this species as well. So at that point we have an estimate on abundance, and we have an estimate on availability of quality habitat, okay habitat, and not so great habitat, but they might be there anyway. And the next step was to try to take these conceptual diagrams that we elicited from the experts and convert them into a predictive projection model for the species. And so this life history diagram pretty easily fits into a matrix population model. Just a couple of things to note, that we took information directly elicited, like this propensity or probability of breeding thing that I mentioned earlier on, and that goes straight into our matrix model. So this is basically just taking this diagram and converting it into a mathematical equation. And I won't go through matrix algebra today, but basically you can take a vector of your current abundances in each of these age classes, and then predict the future abundance at some time step in the future by running it through this population matrix. We also took these complicated conceptual diagrams of their ecology beyond just their life history to try and look for important relationships that we needed to try and predict in the future. And the one that we really honed in on was the effects of the things that affect adult survival. Because we built that matrix and we put in the values into that matrix, and you run a quick sensitivity analysis and you'll see that adult survival is the most important parameter for this species to be viable into the future. And so we started thinking about which of these factors are affecting adult survival the most, and therefore let's figure out a way to simulate those into the future. Just as an example here, one of them was the effects of climate change and on this precipitation, creating these ephemeral puddles and drinking. And so we wanted to look at the effects of drought, the potential effects of climate change-induced drought in the future, on the availability of these turtles to find water and to drink, and its effects on survival. So we created this little function that randomly draws a value of drought each year for the population. The proportion of that population, so this is a proportion of the population exposed to drought times the survival rate times the drought effect. So if some droughts are worse than others, we could have a very large ranging drought that has very little effect on survival, or we could have a very small drought spatially that has a very heavy effect on survival. So we had these two components, of proportion that were exposed to drought and the drought effect. And then the other part of this survival function is the portion that were not exposed to drought, have no drought effect. So your adult survival basically becomes a weighted average of the animals exposed to drought and the animals not exposed to drought. And then that's dropped right into that projection matrix, which is then used to predict the future of the species. So we could take this function and say, well, we had some data on what current drought frequencies were and spatial extent were. Arizona actually keeps good records on county-by-county droughts for 100 years. So the service biologist went through and looked at 100 years of drought records on county-by-county basis, and he just simply calculated the proportion of counties each year that were either in moderate or significant drought. So that's 2 ticks below the average rainfall for that year. And so we knew what these things have probably experienced over the last 100 years or so. And so then we could enroll that as like a baseline of what they might have in the future. And then if climate change was going to increase your drought frequency, we could increase that proportion exposed to drought each year. We could run different scenarios through that. Well, how bad does drought have to get before extinction risk rises to some level that's unacceptable? Or we could just run a set of scenarios that were reasonable, like climate change modelers, climate scientists think that drought is going to increase by 20%, let's say, in that part of the world. So that's exactly what we did, is we ran a whole series of scenarios. There were 2 main components to this. One is habitat loss due to urbanization, and the other is that drought effect that I showed you. And so we ran 9 different scenarios, each for Mexico and the United States, and ran through different drought scenarios. We passed this information forward to the decision makers, a whole series of figures that look like this. It projects the median population size here in the dark line, and then a 95% confidence interval around that. And then the shaded area is the probability of quasi-extinction. So the probability of falling below 4,000 animals in the entire state of Arizona, which is a precipitous decline from 300,000, let's say, down to 4,000. Something's seriously gone wrong. So one thing I want to point out, is that these trajectories are out to 200 years, which is a really long time to be predicting the status of a species. We don't even know if there's going to be a state of Arizona in like 120 years, let alone 200 years from now. So we did that, though, because that's about 8 generations for the Sonoran tortoise. And so that's a biologically meaningful time period for this species. But it's kind of a decision timeline. It's kind of far too long to be making predictions on. And so what you will notice is that for even our worst case scenarios, out to about 50 years, we have almost no extinction, quasi-extinction risk. And even then, it takes maybe out to 75 or 80 years before we hit that 5% probability of extinction. So extinction risk is really low over the next few decades for this species, even in our worst case scenario. Oh, I don't have to press the arrow, I can just move on. So we also, we did this additional step, this additional analysis, because the scenario process, thinking of scenarios that you can run through a model, requires like our imagination as to what we might think the future looks like, and running those things through very specifically. I tried to do this additional step where I built a third loop to our simulation models. And so what this does is your normal simulation model for a population like this has an iteration loop and an annual loop. And so what the iteration loop does is replicate your population, say 1,000 or 5,000 times, and then your annual loop projects it into the future 50 or if you're crazy, 200 years. And so what we did was, and so that you can get replicates and then assess the variability in your predictions that you're passing forward to your decision makers. That's how you get the 95% confidence intervals on your abundance trajectories, and that's how you get the proportion that go extinct. What we did was add a third loop around that, where we could draw random values of what the proportion of the population exposed to drought might be on average for that set of replicates, and what your rate of habitat loss might be for that set of replicates. And we passed those forward, and we ran those 1,000 times, and we got a probability of extinction for that set of drought and habitat loss rates. And then we did that 1,000 times. So we had 1,000 random values of what your drought rates are going to be and what your habitat loss rates are going to be, and a corresponding extinction probability for each of those combinations. What this is basically doing is randomizing the scenario process. So it's expanding our ability to imagine what the future might look like and creating a much more varied set of results for the decision makers. And then we take those results and we can run some regression models and just look at the relationship between drought frequency. That shouldn't be fecundity, that should be maximum population size. So, and probability of extinction. So these parameters that we randomly draw from the outer loop and stick into the replication, and we can estimate the relationship between this probability of extinction and these various components that we randomized and put in there, and we can then tell a decision maker under any drought conditions in the future, or within the range that we simulated, what would be the expected extinction risk for that species. So now we provided them with these tables that said if your magnitude of drought is the same as it is now in the future, and your starting population size is 100,000 animals, your probability of extinction is this. And that extends out to a variety of abundances of starting population size. This would be a 30% increase under the rates of drought that we'd seen in the past. If it got 30% worse into the future, our extinction probabilities would be these. So you could say if any time in the future I have a 200,000 population and my droughts are increasing, my extinction risk is going to be about 6.8%. We thought this was a neat tool that we could pass on to the decision makers. So, yeah, I guess I should have a slide wrapping this up and saying that the decision makers took this information, they looked at this table, they looked at they looked at this table and they would say things like, and we can have a 30% increase in our drought frequency or our drought spatial magnitude, and at our current population sizes, we're still dealing with really low extinction risks at 100 years into the future. So we think the species doesn't need to be listed at this time. They actually came to a not warranted conclusion, which changed their 2011 decision from warranted but precluded. That this species didn't need to be listed because its extinction risk, its predicted extinction risk, was sufficiently low. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about this other species that I just completed the project on. And they just released the decision on this species in September. It's the eastern black rail. And this one was a little more challenging, but it's also a little bit more of a complete story because we go from the data acquisition. We actually had to bring in data from the states, figure out how to analyze those data, and then how to build a model based on those data that we analyzed to try to predict the future. So I think it's a little bit neater of a complete story, but it's newer, so maybe I won't tell it as well. So a little bit of background: the eastern black rail is a small bird. It's the smallest rail in North America. Just for size reference, this is presumably a normal human hand holding one of these birds. So you can see that it's a pretty small bird, maybe sparrow size, which is not usual for rails. We think of clapper rails or big birds that you shoot meat, but these guys are really small. There are up to 4 or 5 subspecies of black rails worldwide, but we have 2 subspecies in North America, the eastern black rail and the California black rail. This one is slightly larger with duller plumage than the California black rail, but you're probably never going to see one because they're so elusive that you can hear them in the marshes if you go out at night and you play the right callback, but you're probably not going to see one. I follow somebody on Twitter, Arielle Fournier, and she's a rail biologist, and she did her whole PhD on rails, and she finally saw her first one just last week, and there's a picture of her like crying holding this bird. Anyway, they're super duper difficult to see, but they're also like a birder's dream. Birders, to hear there's a black rail in an area, like on some listserv or whatever, people start flocking to that area to try to see them and get a look at them. They are actually pretty specialist in their habitat preferences. So they'll live in saltwater or interior freshwater wetlands, but they really require very, very shallow wetlands. Something like 0 to 6 centimeters of water is all they can tolerate, because they're pretty small, as I showed you. And so they like to have these very shallowly flooded wetlands that they lay their egg, they build nests in the reeds, and then they forage throughout them. The vegetation structure is what's important to these animals, not necessarily the vegetation community, which is why they can also live in freshwater and saltwater. It doesn't matter what kind of plants are there as long as the structure is correct. And they have a very varied diet of basically invertebrates that they find in these marshes. I couldn't do this without pointing out that these guys have super duper cute babies. So that's an important part of this. So it was petitioned to list, the service was petitioned to list the black rail, the eastern black rail in 2010. The Center for Biodiversity Conservation again. They produce a lot of petitions every year for the service. And when they don't like the result, they sue the service over the decision process. But they petitioned the service to list the species. It was largely based on the fact that there has been a dramatic apparent range contraction. So these are all the eBird records for the species from like 1850. So that includes like museum records and hunting records and stuff that people have loaded into eBird. From 1850 to about 2005, I think. And then from 2005 onward, these are all the records. So you have a temporal mismatch there, but it is pretty indicative that they're not being seen very much in the interior anymore, at all anymore. Many of these states up in the Northeast don't even monitor for them anymore because they just consider them extinct. And so there's been a large apparent range contraction, especially in the Northeast and in the interior Midwest and Great Lakes area. So the service, much like with the tortoise, they did this substantial finding, which is one of their jargony words to say that they did this short-term, like 90-day assessment back in 2011, and they found it was substantial, which basically means that the petition is worth looking into more. And then they didn't do anything about it for several years. And in 2017, they decided to do a kickoff and start this species status assessment to do a 12-month finding on the eastern black rail. They worked towards a listing decision meeting in February of that year. So they started this, February of the next year. So they started in July, and then just 8 or 9 months later, we're going to be trying to make this decision after waiting 7 years to even do anything. And so they had to get a recommendation into the Federal Register by September of this year due to a court settlement over this decision, over this delayed decision. So we got together in October, I think, to get started on this analysis, and we got started very hastily and tried to make some progress quickly. And so this is the representation components that we put together. And just like with the tortoise stuff, I didn't work on this stuff as much. My postdoc did. And so I'm not going to go into the details here. But we did, we took all of those encounter locations. And we did, she did this cool analysis that I should learn more about so I can present on it. Because it was like a point similarity analysis, kind of like a principal components analysis from like a vegetation community ecology class. And it looked at the similarity of all the points and then clustered them into similarness. And this is what we came up with. It turns out all the points up here, they have distinct environmental variables compared to these ones and these ones. So this is the set of analysis units that we came up with to serve as representation components of the decision moving forward. So then our process was to look at how many resilient populations, or what's the resiliency of this group here, what's the resiliency of that region there, what's the resiliency of that region there, so on and so forth. part of this process, the service does a data call. So they reach out to all of the state agencies and potential researchers and universities, and they say to them, we're about to make this decision about whether or not to list this species. And if you have any data or information that you're willing to share with us about the species that might help us make our decision, please send it our way. And rails are black rails are fortunate in that they are captured under the umbrella of the North American Marsh Bird Survey. So they're actually one of the species that are targeted on the Marsh Bird Survey, which has been conducted nationwide since 2011. And a lot of these states, actually, especially in the southeast, specifically targeted black rails and modified the survey to go to habitats that they thought would be better for black rails because they anticipated that this decision might be coming up in the next couple of years. So we actually had a ton of data available to us from this Marsh Bird Survey in states like South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Texas had a lot of data, and they were doing it in Kansas and in the interior as well. So we got these data, which are basically occupancy data, as is shown here. But we were also really fortunate that some of the states, some of the years, did multiple visits to single sites, and they went back to the same sites for 3 or 4 years in a row. So we could actually work towards a dynamic occupancy analysis, which was really quite useful because not only can you try to guess or get an estimate of how many are out there, how many sites out there are occupied, you can also estimate if it's not occupied now, what's the probability of colonization in a year from now? Or if it is occupied now, what's the probability of it going extinct a year from now? That's the real benefit of these dynamic occupancy models. So we could take these data from South Carolina. They had a lot of really useful data, you guys. It was really great. Something like 400 points that they'd surveyed 4 years in a row. It was the best data set we had. This is just an example of some of the data. We could take NLCD, land cover data, or fire ant presence, or precipitation, or any other environmental covariates to try to look at a couple of things. But first and foremost would be those species needs. We could test the hypotheses that are out there about what the species needs in a quantitative context by modeling these probabilities with these occupancy data and figuring out if they're correlated with any of these covariates that we could draw out of remotely sensed or concurrently collected data points. And so we went ahead and did those occupancy analyses for the 4 regions that still have rails and have rail monitoring ongoing. So you probably noticed there were a couple of encounter points here in the upper, maybe up here around Chicago. We don't know what's going on with those. There were 2 encounters with rails in 2011. The first time they'd been seen in Illinois in decades. And it just so happened that the American Ornithologists Union had a meeting in Chicago that year, and there's a little wetland next to the meeting site, and somebody said that they saw a rail there. So we weren't sure how to handle those data, but the state of Illinois just considers them extinct and doesn't bother to monitor for them anymore. But we do have them in these 4 regions. And so we did these current condition occupancy analyses. We found that occupancy was really, really low across our sites. So in the Great Plains, which we had about 26 or 30 sites here to estimate from, about 13% of our sites were probably occupied. In Texas and the Southwest, down here, we had 25% occupancy rate. In the Southeast, we had a 10% occupancy rate. And that was saved by Florida, because the South Carolina data indicated that occupancy was about 3% of sites were occupied. And that's out of 400 sites that were specifically targeted for black rails. And so we inferred that to mean that resiliency, we inferred that to mean that redundancy is potentially quite low for this species within each of these regions. And if we have 10% of our available habitat occupied, that means that 90% is not occupied right now. And that's not a good picture. So the service determined with those occupancy estimates, they took that information and they determined that these 4 regions had low resiliency and low redundancy because of those occupancy estimates being so low. And they determined that the regions where there are no rails anymore, that there is no resiliency in those locations. So we had some cool results here, though, that we could work with. One was that the best data set, the South Carolina data set and the Southeast data set, showed us that there was year-specific persistence probabilities. So in 1 year out of our 4 years of data, the probability of persistence was something like 99%. So when they went from 1 year to the next, all the sites that were occupied the previous year, almost all of them were occupied the second year. But then in other years, there was really, really low persistence probability, like down in the 30s. So if you went to all of your same sites, only 30% of them were occupied in year 4, or something like that. So we had this dynamic of these year-specific occupancy probabilities, and we felt like that justified us setting up a year-specific occupancy or persistence draw, which I'll talk a little bit about, I think. Colonization rate was extremely low for all regions and all the data sets that we had. So once a site winks out, probability of them coming back is very low. And we're talking like 0.0001 probability of recolonization. So that's not good. We also found that detection probability was about 25% in all of our analysis units. So that kind of gave us confidence that that the surveys were okay. That's actually a pretty high detection probability in a bird study. So the surveys were probably okay, which led us to have some confidence in the other parameters that we were estimating in this system. So what we did was design a projection model that would try to project the occupancy of sites over time. And here's just a little schematic of how that works. If you have a site that's occupied in 1 year, is it occupied in the next year? That's a function of its natural persistence probability, which is actually a function of whether or not it's a good year, an okay year, or a bad year. So if it's a good year, we draw from a distribution. We draw that natural persistence probability from a distribution that's really, really high, like 0.99, 0.98. If it's an okay year, we were drawing from a distribution with a mean of about 0.6. If it was a bad year, we drew from a mean that was about 0.34. And then those persistence probabilities could be modified by the environmental factors that were deemed important, like land management. What kind of fire regime is out there? What kind of grazing is on those landscapes? What proportion of the land is exposed to bad management practices? And then flooding and hydrology. So a big issue for these critters is going to be sea level rise in coastal salt marsh habitats, especially with storm surges occurring during the breeding season. If you get more than 6 inches or 6 centimeters, of water in those sites, their nests are going to fail and they're going to abandon those sites. And the more frequently you get those plus 6 centimeter inundations, those sites are just going to become unusable to the rails. So the persistence probability declines as your hydrology gets worse for that site. So our number, here's some math and some equations for us. Our number of sites occupied at some time in the future is just a binomial probability trial for the number of sites currently occupied, and the probability of success there is 1 minus the extinction risk. This is just a little nomenclature. And then this just points out that some of these arrows are not going the right way. So this is the number of sites previously occupied, and then this is the persistence probability. 1 minus the extinction is the same as persistence. So we then incorporated this colonization component, where a second portion of this equation was that the number of sites occupied in the future was that number occupied in the past that remain occupied, plus the number of sites from your total universe of sites that get colonized in a specific year. So this funky Y is your colonization probability, and the U indicates the total number of possible sites in that region. And the initial number of sites occupied was also a random variable because we don't know where they are and how many there are. So your number of the sites initially occupied is a function of the total universe of sites times that initial occupancy probability. all of these parameters come right out of that data analysis from the dynamic occupancy stuff that I showed you a couple slides ago. Oh, that's what I just did. So all of those parameters come right out of that dynamic occupancy modeling that I showed you just a couple slides ago. So yeah, that's why we focused on those sites that had multi-year surveys. Here it gives you the sample sizes. We had 396 sites from South Carolina for 4 years, 64 sites in Florida for 2 years, 300 in Texas, and then 28 in Kansas. I think I said 26 to 30, so that was a pretty good guess. Those parameters were passed forward. So we took that modeling framework, and just like with the Sonoran Tortoise model, we designed some scenarios that we could put in there that would mimic different rates of sea level rise into the future, different rates of other causes of habitat loss. There's apparently aquifer depletion problems in the Midwest, Kansas and Colorado, and so that's drying out some of the wetlands that they use now. It's almost the opposite problem. But we developed these scenarios that we could then run through and present to the decision makers a variety of future possible source sites, or excuse me, future possible states of the population. And so to do that, we had the habitat loss rate, and this was to try to mimic those sea level rise problems or that hydrology problem in the Midwest. Where we basically just over time would reduce the universe of possible sites that could be colonized or could be occupied. So each time step, U was reduced by a percentage as you march through into the future. And so that limits your ability to recolonize sites if they go extinct currently. And we based some of those habitat loss rates on NOAA data relating to sea level rise and urbanization rates throughout the range. And so they were based in reality of what might happen. We took the core NOAA rate of sea level rise and then added 10% and subtracted 10% to sort of get a good, bad, and okay scenario there. We also had a habitat management component, so the types of the grazing and the burning on these wetlands and how they affect the rails was supposed to be an important part of this. So our extinction probability became a function of the proportion of habitat exposed to poor habitat management conditions and what the effect of that was on our extinction risk. So our overall extinction risk, and this looks just like that survival function from the drought and the tortoises. It's a weighted average of the habitat that's not managed very well and the habitat that is managed very well. And then those scenarios of good and bad habitat management were drawn from the National Wetlands Inventory as a sort of baseline as to what those might be. So we designed 5 scenarios of future habitat loss and habitat management for the service to consider. This is what they look like. This is the proportion of sites remaining occupied at 25 years, 50 years, and in year 2100, so at the turn of the next century. We did this proportion of sites still occupied as it's a relative metric to what we might currently have. What we currently have is unknown. You guys might remember that I randomized the starting conditions for each scenario, for each simulation. And so rather than say in 20 years we're going to have 68 sites occupied, because we don't know what we currently have occupied, what does that mean to 68? But we are going to have, in 25 years, 18% of our sites still occupied. So it doesn't matter what you start with. In 25 years, only 18% of those are probably still going to be occupied. So we ran this for each of our analysis units. We produced some of these figures that, again, look a little bit like the Sonoran Tortoise figures, but they show the median number of sites remaining occupied and then a confidence interval around those. And so I did want to point out we had one scenario that was really like a conservation-intensive scenario. If you worked really hard to preserve habitat for this species, would it be a viable species? And that's what this one looked like. So this was a 0.5% loss rate of your habitat due to sea level rise or the hydrology problems in those regions. And so if you do that, you'd still have maybe 70% of your sites still occupied in the future, with a lot of variability around those predictions. We also predicted the future or the time period of complete extirpation under each of our scenarios in each of our regions shown here. So the Great Plains is not looking very good, and then the other 4 regions is not looking very much better. You know, somewhere on the order of 2070 or so would be the median extinction, complete extinction for the species throughout its range. So that information was passed forward to the decision makers. We let's see, that slide's out of place. I'm sorry. So we passed that information forward to the decision makers. We decided that, as I said, that resiliency was a metric of those proportion of sites still occupied. That's also, in a way, a measure of redundancy in the future. The 3 analysis units that are currently extinct, we expect will continue to be extinct in the future, unless there's some serious work being done. They also expected and passed forward to the decision makers that there is a high probability of extirpation from all 4 other regions that are currently extinct by 2068. I think is the most optimistic future status. And so, you know, redundancy and representation, if all of your analysis units are likely to go extinct within 50 years or 53 years or something, you know, you have very low representation of the future and low resiliency and low redundancy. So at the end of all that, the service came out with their decision. This was an interesting process for me because I was not allowed to be a part of the decision, and none of the people would tell me what the decision was until September or until October when it was released. So my friend texted me the press release on October 5th when it came out. They decided to list the black rail as threatened, and that was in large part due to the abysmal trajectories that we predicted for the species. But it was listed as threatened instead of endangered, in part because of the uncertainty in the modeling that went behind that, and their limited confidence in like the basic occupancy analysis that we did. So it's going to get listing and it's going to get protection to some extent. So that's all the slides that I prepared today. And I have no idea if I've gone over time. Yeah, I went way over. I'm sorry. So, but I'm happy to take questions if you guys want to ask me any questions, or you can leave and we can talk about it later.
Questions for Conor?
So, in all the models that you've done for the extinction rate, have you ever considered like the socioeconomic significance of the species? Like probably a socioeconomic value towards that, which contributes to the extinction rate of the species?
Not on listing decisions. Yeah, with Endangered Species Act, you're not actually really allowed to consider the economic components of the decision process. I think it's an explicit part of the law that your listing has to be done in essence of how much of an effect it's going to have on the economy. It's supposed to be purely about this future status of the species and whether or not it's at risk of extinction. And so we don't roll in socioeconomic components to any of these decision models that we do. I've done some of that stuff in modeling other species for other decision contexts. In fact, so in other decision contexts you might model those kinds of things, but not here in this case. Yeah.
So would you say that the Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't use the precautionary approach, as the lack of more data led to a lighter listing?
Okay, so
then appeared warranted?
The on-the-record response is that you're going to have to ask the Fish and Wildlife Service how they feel about that. The off-the-record, don't quote me response is not anymore.
Recorded.
Okay. Yeah, I don't really know. I think that you know, like I said, the service of the decision makers on that, and it's their purview. They actually specifically asked me to leave the room on that portion of the discussion. I think it is interesting. Like, I have my own opinion about what the status of that, what that decision should have been, but I'm not the decision maker, and so I'm not privy to what they considered as part of that decision process. It looks to me like that species is in big trouble, and I'm just pleased that it got any listing at all.
And Conor is taking off after this, so we'll be going to
Yeah, she's totally started tracking.
Yeah, so it's Tuesday.
Tell me to do something, I'm on.
I appreciate that. You took a self-service observation and we filled this all out. That's great.
We're going out.
Well, I'm glad that Alex and today. So, let's see like
So you just got here.
Take your time.
I thought the stuff you get so grabbed.
Yeah,
Good.
yeah, but well, I can sure use South Carolina stuff.
No, I know.
Nice to meet you. Thanks for saying that.
It's a really cool, that was a really cool way to do that.
This system.
I know, like, I'm so.
See you again, I'm sorry.
No, I'm Stacy.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty worn out today, so I'm sorry.
With half the justification you have to be Stacy.
Not doing the job today.
Might meet him when you're down at Auburn's.
Was she coming in on?
I think that's the plan, is
Oh,
what,
for
that's
this
the
big
reason.
meeting. Oh, okay.
To get all the students together.
No, I just emailed, but I said like,
Yeah.
I said maybe I need to like for a phone call between, I said like tomorrow through Tuesday.
Sorry, everyone else.
That's okay.
Oops.
Really
I think I
practice
said
my time.
Tuesday.
Yeah, I mean, he might work Monday, so a lot of us have to work in this week.
I was counting how many times
I
you said
don't know, not yet.
Yeah,
But
I feel like
it'll be
it's
I
not
turtle
mean, it's
before
gonna be a lot
I
of
was in that meeting.
tracker estimation.
In that meeting, I'm up there asking all this stuff.
People are just
Focus on that.
And I'd be like, oh, sorry, Tortoise, I'm not Tortoise, I'm sorry.
You don't tell Tortoise you have
They were like, sorry about it. We're all turtles. Tortoise is our just type of turtle. Yeah, and I was like,
We're gonna dig
they're so cool because if this was a bird, and I
so
was
it's gonna
calling
be
a
a
sparrow
condensed
a
class.
fish.
So it's not gonna be all semester.
Yeah, like, you know,
It'll